Welcome, and thank you everyone for joining us for today's conference call on ADL's 10th anniversary of the Global 100 survey. Please note that the call will be recorded and accessible via the ADL YouTube channel shortly after the press conference ends. In order to maintain focus on our speakers, all participants' mics and videos have been turned off. However, please note that there is a chat option on the bottom of the Zoom program where you can type in your question at any time. Alternatively, you can also email questions at any point to adlmedia@adl.org. Questions will be answered following the closing remarks. With us today are ADL CEO and National Director, Jonathan Greenblatt, ADL Senior Vice President for International Affairs, Ambassador Marina Rosenberg, ADL Vice President of the Center for Anti-Semitism Research, Matt Williams, and Ipsos Vice President for Public Affairs, Mallory Newell. Jonathan will share top-line findings of this year's Global 100 survey. Matt and Mallory will provide insights into the methodology and delve deeper into the research findings. And Marina will then highlight ADL's global efforts to combat hate and outline actionable steps for meaningful change. And now I'll turn it over to ADL CEO and National Director, Jonathan Greenblatt.
Thank you, Mayan, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. This has been quite a year for the Jewish community, the world over. We not only witnessed one of the deadliest days in Israel's history on 10/7. It was a tragic day for Jewish people around the world. And in the 466 days since that unprecedented, unprovoked attack, the number of anti-Semitic incidents worldwide has been unprecedented. In America alone, anti-Semitic incidents were up more than 200% compared to the year previously. We live in a world in which a literal modern-day pogrom can take place in the streets of a major Western European capital, unchecked for hours. And in the aftermath, we are gaslit and told that what happened was something we imagined, or blame the victims for the act in the first place. And while tracking anti-Semitic incidents is an essential way to measure anti-Semitism, it's by no means the only way. Negative attitudes towards Jews and agreement with age-old anti-Semitic tropes have been a crucial pillar that ADL has used to assess overall levels of anti-Jewish prejudice within a country. It is a key factor that impacts how free a Jewish person feels to live openly and express their identity, whatever that looks like for them. Why do attitudes matter so much? Because attitudes lead to action. When anti-Semitic views are normalized, when anti-Jewish bigotry takes root, it creates an environment where Jews become more vulnerable, more susceptible to attacks, where extremists are emboldened, and where too many turn a blind eye to hatred. To better understand this climate today, ADL released the latest installment of our Global 100 survey, the most extensive study of anti-Semitic attitudes worldwide. Along with Ipsos, the respected global research firm based out of Paris, ADL surveyed nearly 60,000 adults in 103 countries and territories, representing roughly 94% of the global adult population. This marks the first time in a decade that we've polled in all 103 countries, including the original Global 100 that we initially did in 2014. And in the decade since, a lot has happened, and the findings we're going to share with you today are deeply troubling. Let's go to that first slide. We found that 46% of adults hold significant anti-Semitic beliefs, 46%. That means nearly 1 in 2 adults worldwide endorse a majority of 11 anti-Semitic tropes, like Jews are responsible for most of the world's wars, or Jews are more loyal to Israel than the home country they live in. The number of adults harboring anti-Semitic attitudes has surged from nearly 1.1 billion in 2014 to more than 2.2 billion in this latest survey. That is an astonishing increase. And indeed, since that first survey, the index score has soared from 26 to 46. I don't have the words to adequately describe how dangerous this spike is. In a world in which Jews are dehumanized, the Jewish state delegitimized, and Jewish people held to double standards, we shouldn't be surprised when terrible, ferocious attacks are perpetrated on them. Now, if we take this global data and drill down on the regions, there are some interesting findings worth sharing. Just over 3/4 of the respondents in the Middle East and North Africa believe most of the 11 tropes to be true, despite being a region with little to no Jewish presence outside of the State of Israel. Additionally, about half of the respondents in Asia, Eastern Europe, and Sub-Saharan Africa also demonstrate high levels of anti-Semitic attitudes. Again, in Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, there are very few, almost no Jewish people. It's truly shocking that even in the areas of the world with the best index scores, meaning the lowest levels of prevalent anti-Semitism, we still find that around 1 in 5 adults hold anti-Jewish racist ideas. That's the case here in the Americas at 24%, in Oceania with 20%, and in Western Europe with 17%. So again, in relative terms, the scores are much better. But what does it say when 1 out of 5 people hold these toxic views? And actually, if we break the data down even more and take a look at some of the countries within these numbers, it's also quite stunning. The top 5 countries with the highest levels of anti-Semitic attitudes worldwide are first the territories of the West Bank and Gaza at 97%. And then actual countries like Kuwait, 97%, Indonesia, 96%, and Bahrain, 95%. Imagine a world like Indonesia, where again, there are negligible Jewish people, and yet 96% of the population holds terribly entrenched anti-Semitic views. While the countries at the bottom with the lowest index scores are Sweden at 5%, Canada, the Netherlands, and Norway at 8%. The United States comes in at 9%. But what's important to note that even in the countries with the lowest levels of anti-Semitic attitudes, and that is unquestionably a good thing, we've seen shocking anti-Semitic incidents that are often perpetrated by a small, vocal, and violent minority. We're talking about hardened activists that harbor hatred toward Jews and the Jewish state, and they feel emboldened to act on it. Look, I don't have to remind you about the horrific rape of a 12-year-old Jewish girl in Paris, a child, or the arson attack on a synagogue in Melbourne, Australia, or the repeated acts of vandalism on Jewish institutions in Toronto and across Canada, or what happened here in the United States, where masked activists, I should call them antagonists, have repeatedly threatened and committed acts of violence against Jewish people on college campuses, in public places, you name it. And that doesn't even begin to cover the extent of the anti-Semitic attacks that took place all over the year in the countries, again, with the lowest scores. Now let's talk quickly about Holocaust awareness. We know that the Shoah was a seminal event, not just for the Jewish people, but all of humanity. And yet, we found that 20% of respondents worldwide had not even heard of the Holocaust. Less than half of the respondents recognized the Holocaust's historical accuracy, and that falls to 39% among those under the age of 35. Think about that. More than 60% of millennials and Gen Z, people under the age of 35, don't recognize the historical accuracy of the Holocaust. Worse still, that younger generation is more likely to hold anti-Semitic beliefs in general. I'm talking about stereotypes of Jewish power, or false ideas about Jewish loyalty, or scapegoating Jewish people for global conflicts. I mean, simply put, the data is really highlighting a very worrying demographic trend that many of us have assumed, but it's now proving to be undeniably real. Look, this does not bode well for the future, and we need to see this as a wake-up call. This data tells us countries all over the globe have got to take anti-Semitism seriously. They need to confront this hate head on. Governments need to speak out clearly and forcefully. They need to speak out repeatedly. And leaders must call out anti-Semitism wherever and whenever it occurs, particularly when it happens within the ranks of their own party or partisan group. But words are not enough. We need to see words backed up by actions. We need strong hate crimes laws that not only deter bigotry, but also provide tangible protections for the Jewish community and, by the way, other vulnerable groups targeted by hate and extremism. We at ADL believe we must clearly define what anti-Semitism is so that communities, institutions, corporations, media outlets, and of course government can recognize it and take action accordingly. And we have got to invest in education. Children need to learn about history and actually I should say not just history, really the past and the present of the Jewish people, the realities of the Holocaust, the dangers of hate. Teaching empathy, historical truth, and critical thinking is essential to countering ignorance and intolerance. And we need not just interventions in the proverbial classroom. We need interventions outside the classroom, curricular reviews, viewpoint diversity, considering things like tenure reform. I say this because it's not enough to change what we teach. The how we teach also matters. And look, as I said just a moment ago, or at least I alluded to, the prevalence of conspiracy theories, including anti-Semitic tropes, harms societies and undermines democracies. Anti-Semitism itself is a kind of conspiracy theory that casts the Jews as villains in humanity's story. But blaming a group of people, blaming them for broader problems, it may be as old as the hills, but it has newfound urgency now for us to stop it because we've seen the vulnerability of the Jewish community and beyond. And such scapegoating isn't just dangerous for the Jewish people, it's dangerous for societies. It reflects a kind of dysfunction, again, not just against Jews, but against the West, against democracies, against the systems and the values that hold us together. For these reasons, ADL is working closely with our partners worldwide to confront and combat anti-Jewish hate wherever it manifests. In just a moment, we will hear from Marina Rosenberg, ADL Senior Vice President for International Affairs. Ambassador Rosenberg will discuss our global efforts to combat hate and the recommendations that we have for actionable steps that leaders can take. But before we hear from Ambassador Rosenberg, I'd first like to introduce Mallory Newell, Vice President of Public Polling at Ipsos, and Dr. Matt Williams, ADL Vice President for the Center of Anti-Semitism Research. Together, they're going to dive deeper into our survey's findings and the methodology behind it. Over to you, Mallory.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today, and I appreciate being part of this historic event as we launch this 10-year anniversary of the Global 100. My name is Mallory Newell. I'm a vice president at Ipsos, which is a global market research firm. Ipsos is incredibly proud to be playing just a small part in this important and impactful research endeavor. I'll spend a few minutes talking about the ins and outs of the survey, how it was conducted, where it was conducted, before turning it over to Matt. This research, as Jonathan noted, was conducted in 103 countries and territories around the world, accounting for the vast majority of the world's population. Ipsos conducted the research in all regions except for the Middle East and North Africa, which was conducted by other research partners, GDCC, Ronan, and Catalyze Global Research. This survey is comprised of over 58,000 interviews that were conducted between late July and early November 2024. The survey features over 80 unique languages or dialects. The survey was done using best-in-class methodology to ensure that all country samples were reflective of each country's population, that they were nationally representative, and utilized a probability-based sampling approach. This is all to say that we have great confidence in the data that's being reported today. To undertake this survey, it was a combination of a couple of different methods. We used Ipsos's probability-based online knowledge panel, telephone, and face-to-face. The vast majority of the research in these countries was conducted via telephone, but we used the approach that best suited each country on the ground. Each country or territory had a sample size of either 500 interviews or 1,000 interviews of adults 18 and over. The sample was comprised of those who indicated that they were a resident of their country. So those who said that they were just living there temporarily or visiting were excluded from the sample. Now, as Jonathan alluded to, the bulk of this research did focus on the 11 core Global 100 index questions. These questions are designed to assess whether people believe these anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish tropes to be true or false. The index score that Jonathan just highlighted, and that Matt will go a little bit more in depth on, is derived by taking the number of respondents in each country, each region, or globally who think a majority, that is at least 6 out of 11, are true. Now, as you see on this slide, overall we had 3 topic areas in the survey that we focused on. We had the index score, measuring levels of anti-Semitism. We had questions around anti-Jewish and anti-Israel sentiments. So this is things like whether you believe that your country should have diplomatic relations with Israel, should boycott Israeli products or businesses, or even allow Israeli tourists into your country, as well as favorability toward different religious groups, as well as Israel, Palestine, and Hamas. And then finally, a section of the survey focused on Holocaust denial and acceptance of conspiracy theories around whether or not you believe, again, as Jonathan alluded to, have you even heard of the Holocaust, but do you believe that what history has told us is accurate or not? As Jonathan mentioned, the Global 100 survey in its entirety is the most extensive study on anti-Semitic attitudes conducted around the world. Now I'm pleased to turn it over to Matt to dive in a little bit deeper to the findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Mallory, and thank you. And I have to express my gratitude to the entire Ipsos team for the wonderful and rigorous, sophisticated work that you all did. I'm going to dive deeper into the index questions from the Global 100 survey, which form, as mentioned, the foundation of each country and region's index score. You can go to the next slide. Here you can see the range of questions included, from statements like Jews have too much power in the business world to Jews have a lot of irritating faults. And here we have sort of 4 response options, and then a 5th non-response option. I want to focus on 2 of these in particular. The first one, Jews' loyalty is only to Israel, or expressed in a slightly different way, Jews are more loyal to Israel than to the country that we're kind of probing the particular population about. This continues to lead in terms of tropes. It's one of actually the few tropes that steadily increased both in the United States and around the world over the last 50 years. This trope, frankly, may not seem as bad as some of the other ones, right? So Jews are responsible for most of the world's wars as a kind of extreme example, but it really points to how people have a hard time understanding the difference between Jews and Israel and how they conflate those things. And what happens is when that happens in a particular population, we see an increased probability of Jews becoming targets of anti-Israel sentiment. And obviously we've seen a lot of that happening lately with our own eyes. The second trope that I want to call your attention to is Jews don't care what happens to anyone but their own kind. And this sits at 50% agreement around the world. In the US and in several other countries we've studied so far, this one continues to be the most predictive of hostility. This means that those who agree with this statement are more likely to say that a Jewish victim of a violent crime deserved it. They're more likely to indicate that an assailant of a Jewish person should receive a shorter jail sentence comparatively, or no jail sentence at all. Now, many of these statements probe perceptions of power and influence, which on their own can be damaging conspiracy theories. This one in particular carries not just a lack of warmth at the very least, but also a perception of malice, which ultimately contains a much more violent valence. The next slide. So the second set of questions probe Holocaust knowledge and denial. It's important to note that the responses to these questions, as well as the next set that we'll touch on, aren't actually calculated into our index scores. They're not part of our index, they're part of the larger instrument overall. So as we can see here, Holocaust denialism itself, which sits at 4% globally, is still relatively rare, but distortion is frankly not. Less than half, 48% of respondents overall, recognize the Holocaust's historical accuracy. This falls actually to 39% among 18 to 34-year-olds, that particular demographic. Now, 17% of respondents distort the Holocaust, agreeing with the statement, the Holocaust happened, but the number of Jews who died in it has been greatly exaggerated by history. Now, indeed, we actually have encountered a form of gaslighting that, for my team at the Center for Anti-Semitism Research, highlights sort of a troubling evolution in anti-Semitic rhetoric, from outright denial of the Holocaust's existence to the gradual denial of its significance. So consider this argument, and we see this pretty frequently. We know that intergenerational trauma suppresses the achievements of later generations. We know that, which suggests that the Holocaust ultimately was not that significant of an event, right? So that framing right there, that reasoning seeks to diminish the Holocaust's profound historical and moral impact. And it reduces its significance to a trope-informed debate over outcomes for later generations. This narrative erases the reality of the suffering endured and the atrocities committed, perpetuating a dangerous form of distortion. Now, moving on to our final set of non-index questions, those focused on anti-Israel and anti-Jewish sentiments, we can, sort of keep on going. Now, what's really critical here is, while favorability is low, in most regions, there's a real mix of opinion regarding Israel and Palestine. However, the fact that nearly 1/4 of respondents globally expressed a favorable opinion of the Hamas terrorist organization is indeed striking. Now, what is particularly alarming is that under 35 years old respondents, or 29%, are 13 percentage points more likely than respondents above the age of 50 to express favorable opinions of Hamas. So broken down by age, these things begin to really look potentially alarming. But while the favorability is mixed, what is absolutely fascinating is that discrimination against Israel and Israelis is not mainstream. On tourists, on diplomacy, and on boycotts, all show majorities of the world open to continuing relations with Israel and Israelis. This is a critical finding and speaks to how extreme, frankly, some of the anti-Israel protests and platforms have become. And indeed, we continue to find a substantive and meaningful relationship, set of correlations between these kinds of discrimination and negative feelings about Jews and Israelis captured in these sets of questions with the earlier shared measures of anti-Jewish tropes that make up the index. And now I'll pass it over to ADL Senior Vice President of International Affairs, Marina Rosenberg.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it. And thank you all for being here today. Despite the many concerning findings we just heard, the ADL Global 100 also highlights critical areas where governments must act to positively reverse these trends. By understanding this data, we find real opportunities to make an impactful and lasting change. Encouragingly, 57% of adults around the world acknowledge that hatred towards Jews is a serious global issue. This recognition spans across all geographical regions, age groups, education levels, and political orientations, highlighting immense potential for transformative action. Given this data, governments must engage this supportive majority to enact legislative protections for Jews and implement targeted Holocaust education for younger generations to mitigate harmful prejudices and flat-out hate. But just as those who recognize anti-Semitism as a problem are present in society, so are those who hold hateful views. And to combat this hate head-on, it's critical to understand that anti-Semitism also originates from a wide array of sources and spans political spectrums, communities, and belief systems. To put it simply, no one has a monopoly on anti-Semitism. It can come from anywhere and anyone. And while there is no silver bullet, no one singular action that can eradicate anti-Semitism, implementing best practices that have proven effective worldwide can help protect Jewish communities and reduce the threat. Some best practices can be found in the Global Guidelines for Countering Anti-Semitism, first launched in July 2024, which many governments and international governmental organizations worldwide have already endorsed. And as we consider strategic frameworks, such as the Global Guidelines, it's crucial to recognize the practical steps being taken around the world. This brings us to ADL's global work, focusing on key areas of advocacy, research, monitoring, and education. Now allow me to briefly dive into these four categories one by one. So first of all, advocacy. ADL spearheads advocacy initiatives both here in the US and internationally. Our efforts encourage governments to take firm, sustained action against anti-Semitism, both domestically and internationally, including adopting and implementing national plans to combat anti-Semitism, appointing special envoys to lead these initiatives, developing legislation to drive greater education and recognition of anti-Semitism, both in the real world and online, as well as enforcement of action against hate crimes and extremism. Second, research. ADL is deeply committed to a research-driven, data-based approach. Our data, which includes insights from the Global 100 survey, US focus research, and the J7 survey that examines anti-Semitic attitudes in 7 countries with the largest Jewish populations, empower us to strategically address hate. ADL's Global Atlas website serves as a one-stop source for information on anti-Semitism globally. As a trusted data source, these initiatives and resources enhance our capacity to combat anti-Semitism effectively. Number 3, monitoring and response. The annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States serves as a crucial tool for assessing hate levels domestically. In light of the events of October 7, 2023, we also released updated preliminary data, showing over 10,000 anti-Semitic incidents in the US alone in the year following Hamas massacre. Internationally, we collaborate with partners around the world, providing monitoring tools and resources for local communities. And lastly, education. Education stands as a cornerstone of ADL's global work. We provide diverse populations worldwide, both Jewish and non-Jewish, with tools to recognize and counter anti-Semitism while promoting understanding of Jewish life and the Holocaust. For example, our Words to Action program, a dynamic workshop equipping Jewish students against anti-Semitism, has reached unprecedented impact. In 2024 alone, ADL conducted over 160 training sessions across Europe and Latin America, engaging around 3,000 Jewish youth and adults in 21 countries in 15 languages. These initiatives exemplify ADL's dedication to building a safer, more inclusive world by empowering communities and influencing policy on a global scale. Yet, as anti-Semitic tropes and beliefs become alarmingly normalized across societies worldwide, it's important to understand that this dangerous trend is not just a threat to Jewish communities. It's a warning to us all. Even in countries with the lowest level of anti-Semitic attitudes globally, we've seen many anti-Semitic incidents perpetrated by an emboldened, small, and violent minority that is basically holding society hostage with their hate. As we can see here, these countries have some of the lowest index score. However, as Jonathan mentioned earlier, it's no secret that anti-Semitic incidents have soared in these countries since October 7, 2023. There's no denying it. And that's why a comprehensive view of anti-Semitism in any country must include not just anti-Semitic attitudes, but also incidents, government policies, public discourse, and religious freedoms. Only by considering all of these aspects collectively can we fully understand and address the environment Jewish individuals face worldwide. Therefore, the fight against anti-Semitism requires an inclusive, holistic, and cooperative strategy that involves government, corporations, academia, civil society, and the public. International organizations must also adopt clear measures to actively tackle anti-Semitism within their structures and jurisdictions. To effectively counter anti-Semitic trends, ADL calls upon governments as well as international and non-governmental organizations to adopt and implement strong and sustained initiatives against anti-Semitism. Many effective measures are outlined in the global guidelines for countering anti-Semitism and provide essential, actionable strategies for addressing and mitigating anti-Semitism on a global scale. Enacting strong measures against anti-Semitism while taking a whole-of-society approach will help create environments where Jews feel safe, able to express their full identities and feel a part of the larger communities. Let's be clear, now is time for action. Let's seize this moment to make a real change. And now I would like to turn it back to our CEO and National Director, Jonathan Greenblatt, for closing remarks. Jonathan?
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Rosenberg. And thanks to all our speakers today, Mallory, Matt, and again, Marina, for providing such excellent insights. As we've seen and heard, anti-Semitism is nothing short of a global emergency, and we're seeing the trends play out all over the globe, from the Middle East to Asia to Europe to North and South America. And it's very obvious that no one region, no one people has a monopoly on morality. Anti-Semitism can happen anywhere. It can come from the political right or the political left. It can come from minority communities. It can come from majority communities. It can come from the religious. It can come from the secular and everywhere in between. That's why we're asking all governments, international and non-governmental organizations, to adopt and implement the global guidelines for countering anti-Semitism, as Marina stated, to protect Jewish communities around the world. I'd welcome all of you to go to our website, adl.org, to explore the Global 100 findings. You can dive deeper into the data, drill down on demographics, compare countries and regions, look at trending data over the last 10 years. There's a rich reservoir of information. Finally, let's just acknowledge that we may be on the verge of a deal to free the nearly 100 Israeli hostages being held against their will in Gaza and to bring an end to the fighting. Let's pray for all the hostages. Bring them home now. Now I'd like to turn it back to Mayan to open it up for questions.
Thanks, Jonathan. We're now going to pause for some Q&A. And as a reminder, there is a chat option at the bottom of your screen where you can type in your questions. And alternatively, you may also email your questions to adlmedia@adl.org. We have already received a few questions via email, so we can dive right in. The first one is for you, Jonathan. How do you explain such a dramatic uptick in anti-Semitic attitudes worldwide over the past decade?
Well, it's a good question. I think there are a few factors. So number one, I think it's clear to us that the rise of conspiracism all around the world, the rise of populism and polarization, it's created a climate that's fertile for scapegoating, for stereotyping. We've seen it throughout history and we're seeing it now. So again, number one, I think the broader political environment. Number two, we've seen the anti-Semitism normalized. You see it from the anti-Zionist left, which has tried to make routine these horrible protests, these ugly actions, and it's all around the world. It's in capitals all over the globe, where you have signs that dehumanize "quote unquote" Zionists, that pretend that it's normal to vandalize a synagogue or to burn down a kosher restaurant because you're upset about policy in the Middle East, which is a fiction and a lie. Or you see on these campuses in the United States and around the world, not just students, but professors try to put an academic veneer on tired, toxic anti-Semitism. So I think anti-Semitism has been normalized as part of the public conversation. Number three, I think social media has scrambled the way we see the world. Again, it has enabled this conspiracism to really take hold. And not only is it social media, which I think it partly explains why the younger demographic has such a higher proportion believing intense anti-Semitic attitudes in the older community, because the younger demographic is not, reading the Times, quote unquote. They're watching TikTok. They're not getting their information from the evening news. They're getting it from Instagram. And on Instagram and TikTok and these other services, there are no guardrails. There are no ombudsmen. There are no fact checkers. It's just, what bleeds leads. And the most salacious thing sells. So I think social media scrambled it. And I should also point out, particularly as we think about the Middle East, the Al Jazeera effect. And by this, I'm speaking specifically of Al Jazeera, the Qatari-owned news outlet, which is a nonstop fountain of anti-Semitism. It has a 24/7, faucet turned on to anti-Israel, anti-Western propaganda. I think that has a lot to do with it as well, particularly accounting for the very high anti-Semitic views in places like North Africa, where there just aren't Jews. So again, I think the political environment, the normalization of anti-Semitism, social media, and the Al Jazeera effect all come together to drive the results that we're seeing today.
Thank you, Jonathan. We have another question that came in via email. They asked Greece, what was the reasoning behind conducting this kind of survey in the countries or regions where virtually no Jews live and where a plurality of the population has never met one? And I think I can send this over to Mallory, if that's okay.
Sure, happy to take this. Great question. So, I want to kind of reiterate something that was said earlier in this press conference, which is that the survey is really intended to get a global baseline of anti-Jewish attitudes, and just to kind of understand the prevalence of the 11 tropes and beyond. And in doing so, right, we didn't want to make assumptions based on a country's estimated Jewish population, or how likely we thought people were to have interacted with a Jewish person. I think it's very clear from the findings in this research that even in countries and regions around the world where the Jewish population is very, very small, if at all present, people can still hold these attitudes. And I think it's instructive to know that even in countries where there are virtually no Jews living there, or even in countries that may border each other, anti-Semitic attitudes can be present and can vary. And so, again, it's really just more about understanding the global baseline and not picking and choosing the countries that we're taking a look at.
Thank you, Mallory. Another general question, but I'll send it over to Marina if that's okay. Would you be able to elaborate a bit more on the younger generation harboring higher levels of anti-Semitic attitudes? Maybe some extra info, what that looks like.
Yes, of course. So we're talking about young adults between the ages of 18 and 34. And a couple of examples are that 40% of them agree with the trope that Jews are responsible for most of the world's wars, which is outrageous. Also, 47% agree with the statement that Jews have a lot of irritating faults. And when it comes to the Holocaust historical accuracy, only 39% hold accurate views of the Holocaust, compared to the 48% in the general population that was asked. So we're really looking here at a demographic time bomb that not just governments and universities, but really all of society need to take into account and take immediate concrete steps to tackle this.
Thank you, Marina. I think we have time just for one more question. Okay, I'll take this one from the chat, and I will pass it on to Matt. Were the global responses weighted by population? For example, on the figures about accepting Israeli tourists? Or were there countries and respondents given equal weight?
It's a great question. Thank you. The Ipsos team weighted everything by existing population data. These were all probability-based samples. And all of them are within a relatively slim margin of error, which varies country by country, depending on the kinds of methodology that was really available at that point in time. But it's, I don't want to understate this. This is probably by far one of the most precise and accurate studies on anti-Semitism, certainly globally, but perhaps anywhere that's ever been done before. And my hat goes off to the Ipsos team for their just incredible work on this particular project.
Thank you, Matt. I know I did say a last question, but we do have a few more in the chat. I'll just do one more so we can wrap up on time. And I will pass this over to Jonathan. Does the ADL believe there will be a lowering of some of these figures after the war, or are these types of numbers here to stay, given the high figures among 18 to 34-year-olds?
Well, I don't think we know the answer to that. I mean, I just want to be clear, anti-Semitism was rising before 10/7. So in some ways, it's fair to say that it created a pretext for bigots. And, anti-Semites have been using 10/7 like fuel to pour fuel on the fire of anti-Jewish hate. But anti-Semitism didn't start with the war and it won't end with the war. And so I think we need to reserve judgment and take a bit of a wait and see approach, even as they say, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. So at ADL, even if the war ends in some way, and I don't think this war is over until every hostage is brought back, until Hamas is destroyed. Nonetheless, even if the fighting stops today and the hostages come home, I don't think that will be some kind of palliative. I think we have to prepare for a new reality, as kind of you asked the question, considering the numbers among the younger demographics. And as Marina laid out, it requires a battery of approaches in order to get our arms around this. Advocacy, education, monitoring, all of it. So we're prepared for the worst, and we'll keep our fingers crossed that the hostages come home and that things will somewhat abate in the days, weeks, and months ahead.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you to everyone. I'm afraid that's all the time we have, and we're now going to close the conference call. However, I do realize we didn't get to all of the questions in the chat, so for any further questions or requests, please do feel free to email us at adlmedia@adl.org. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and have a great one.